My name is Jim Wallace, and as Brian mentioned to you probably, I've been a detective here in Southern California in the Los Angeles area for about 25 years. When I first hired on, you do a lot of different kinds of details. I worked a lot of different kinds of cases and a lot of different kinds of positions. This picture is from when I was working gangs back in the late 80s, early 90s. But also, I was kind of had a history. My dad was a police officer before me. I was born in his academy, so that's him holding me there with his tan academy uniform. So I was born in his academy. My son was born in mine. During that time, though, I can tell you I wasn't always interested in law enforcement. I was an explorer, and as a teenager, the first picture there shows him kind of giving my certificate to me when I was 17 or 16, maybe. And after that, I pursued the arts, and I have a degree in design, a bachelor's in design, and a master's in architecture. But I ended up coming back at 27 to law enforcement, so that's him pinning on that badge there at 27. I can tell you I was not a believer during any of this time. I was a committed atheist. My dad is a committed atheist, has always been, still is. And I was pretty much ended up in my dad's footsteps. Even after pursuing the arts, where do I end up? I end up back as a detective, just like him. So it's a strong draw. And until I was 35, I was a pretty, I think, articulate, not angry. Yeah, I guess you have to say angry. I was just don't bring it up. I don't want to. I'm not going to be talking about it. I'm not going to listen to Christians and their ridiculous arguments. And I was in that position for a number of years. During my time working in working in law enforcement, I did a couple different things. I worked SWAT for a number of years. I worked gangs for a number of years. I worked undercover. So I had my hair all grown out, and I enjoyed that opportunity to work undercover for 4 years. Didn't cut my hair. I didn't even stop cutting my facial hair, too, at some point. So it was just kind of a neat break from having to be high and tight all the time. But during that time, during this time, I was not a believer. But eventually, I started working investigations. I now work nothing but homicides. I started working homicides maybe about 15 years ago. And I eventually did come to faith. We can talk about how that occurred. But now all I work are cold cases. And cold cases are homicides that aren't solved because there's no statute of limitations here in California for homicides. You can do a robbery and, 7 or 8 years later, if they haven't caught you, you're going to get away with it. But if you do a murder, it stays open forever and they can come after you years later. My cases all run in between 1979 and 1988. The guy here you see in the middle who we arrested back about 2 years ago, we just convicted him about a month ago. And he killed his wife in 1981. So that's another Dateline case that'll be on out here in the United States. We have a show called Dateline. I'm not sure if you ever watch it there, Brian, but this is a show that we occasionally will have national coverage on here. So now I take the same principles that we discuss in cold cases, that we use in cold cases, and I try to share them with the churches in my area to help them understand how to use the same principles to make a case for biblical reliability. I think there are some distinctions that can be used. But by the way, this is now my family. My dad's there is 72 when he took this picture, so obviously he's not still in uniform, but he put a uniform back on again for my son's graduation. So now his namesake was hired by our department 50 years to the month after my dad was hired in 1961. So now my son works there. It's just me and him in that department still, but next month it'll just be him. But it's nice to have a touch still there. Another Jim Wallace working for another 30 years at our agency. This is the newly redesigned website we just put up last week, pleaseconvinceme.com. What we're trying to do here is provide tools. These are all messages that I shared with my congregations. After I finally came to faith, I went to seminary, became a pastor, and most of the messages that I shared as a pastor or as a youth pastor are now on this website. They're all apologetics. So I hope there's some resources there, and that this continues to grow. We have a daily post on the blog, and we have a weekly podcast as well. Okay, now this website we're just starting to rebuild. So this is a site that's still now under reconstruction. This is a collection of 500-word responses to the top objections of atheists. So if you're in a conversation and somebody throws that objection up that stops you in your tracks, this is designed to give you a 500-word response to get you past the objection. The other site has got 18-page articles. This is all 500-word, one-page responses to objections in those categories you see there. And finally, we just built this last year because this book I've got now is coming out in January. I got a copy to Brian there, and I'm hoping that this blog will be updated weekly, and this is a connection point for people who are interested in the book. Now let's get started. I do this work because of the work that's been done before me by a lot of angry atheists who are just like me, who would like us to believe that there is no evidence to support what we believe as Christians. So here's a statement from Richard Dawkins, where he says that many of us saw religion as harmless nonsense. Beliefs might lack all supporting evidence, but we thought if people needed a crutch for consolation, where's the harm? Of course, that all changed on September 11th, because as you know, especially if you're in this group, you already know the attack that's in front of us. But, you know, a lot of Christian groups that I talk to, churches and conferences, really aren't quite aware of what is facing us. And when someone like this says we have no supporting evidence, really what I'm hearing, the underlying statement there, is that he believes we have no hard, direct, forensic, physical, testable evidence. That's the problem for him. He doesn't believe that we have anything that we could call evidence. But I suspect that Richard Dawkins has never really worked with evidence a day in his life. He doesn't really know what evidence looks like. And that's the question we're going to discuss tonight. What even qualifies precisely as evidence in the first place? And a lot of the things that we use in criminal investigations, I think we can use in examining the claims of Christianity. So let's take a look at that. First of all, I think there's a distinct resemblance between working cold cases, because when we work cold cases, we're examining events in the distant past, right? These are events that we usually have no living eyewitnesses for. If we had a living eyewitness, it wouldn't be cold to begin with. And typically, we don't have a great deal of forensic evidence. That's been my case. I wish that I had some cases that actually could be solved with DNA. It would sure be great if that was the case. But, you know, that has never been the case in any of these cold cases I've worked. I've never solved a case with a piece of forensic evidence. Instead, we build robust circumstantial cases for juries that then point to the same conclusion and leave you with no other reasonable alternative than the guilt of the person involved. It turns out that these same skill sets that are used to solve cold cases can be used to examine the case for Christianity. Again, Christianity is an event in the distant past. This is the resurrection of Jesus, the life and teaching of Jesus. We have no living eyewitnesses today to tell us about it. We got little or no forensic evidence, but we can build a convincing circumstantial case. And that's what we're going to try to do tonight. Or today, well, for me, it's only 11 o'clock. It's nighttime for you guys, right, Brian? I think it is. Just give me your thumbs up if it's a nighttime. Okay, I just want to know. Okay, so here we go. First rule of evidence. There's a big difference between possible and reasonable. That's huge, and most people have to be instructed about this before we select them as jurors, because they don't really give much thought to the difference between possible and reasonable. And how I like to describe it for groups is, hey, look, anything and everything is possible. It's possible that we're not even connected by the internet tonight. And instead, you're not even in that room. You've imagined it. We've all been kidnapped from our native locations by aliens, brought into their mothership, in which we're now experiencing a mass hypnotic coma. And tomorrow we're going to wake up and discover that none of this even happened. I think if you were to ask the question, isn't this at least possible? Most people would say, well, yeah, it's possible, but it's not reasonable. And that's the difference. There's lots of stuff. Everything and anything is possible, but not everything is reasonable. So let me give you an example of this. I had a case once where a woman was murdered for about $50,000 of her husband's retirement money. He was going to get about $800,000 in retirement. He did not want her to get a share of that. They were divorcing. She was only asking for $50,000. Not bad if you think about it. She managed to work it into the sale of their house. So her attorney captured out $50,000 extra from the sale of the house because her husband was not about to give it to her. And they didn't tell the husband in advance. They sold the house on a Wednesday. He discovered he'd lost $50,000 to her on the Thursday that followed that Wednesday. He killed her on Friday. And he went into her house and shot her in the back of the head. Now, afterwards in trial, we had a defense attorney who argued, hey, isn't this possible? This is a burglary. We had to stop the jury and say, hey, time out. You aren't even allowed to consider that possibility. Why? Well, has he presented any evidence? Is there any forced entry in this house? No. Has he presented any evidence anything was taken from the house? No. Has he presented any evidence there's anybody else who was even in the house other than the victim? No. Has he presented any evidence that there's a rash of burglaries in the neighborhood? You've got no evidence to support that possibility. Therefore, it's not reasonable. Reasonable things are inferences from evidence that's been provided to you. Everything and anything else is a possibility, but it's not reasonable. And when you're deliberating as a jury, you are not allowed to consider what's possible, only reasonable inferences from the evidence. So if somebody in that jury room brings up the possibility of a burglary, you stop them in their tracks. They're not allowed to do that. There's no evidence for such a burglary. So that's the difference between reasonable and possible. Hope we're on the same page, at least on that. Remember, the judicial standard here in our country and everywhere is reasonable, not possible. It's not beyond a possible doubt we're trying to determine whether this guy's guilty. Is he guilty beyond a reasonable doubt? And that is the key difference. And we have to keep that in mind as we examine the evidence. Remember, anything's possible, but not everything is reasonable. So let's go on now and take a look at a case that I'm going to ask you to decide with me. All of you sitting in that room are now the jury. That is your jury room. You are now going to have to deliberate on this case. In this case, I'm trying to determine if this young man who I have in custody committed a murder using that bat. He's telling me he didn't do it, but I got to ask myself a question. Should I believe what he says? How do I know he's even telling me the truth to begin with and I can trust and count on this guy? And also, why should I place any confidence in him at all or even go to him for proper answers? I've got to evaluate whether this guy is the suspect or not. Now, if you're on this trial with me and you're the jury, and I called this one piece of evidence in, do you think it would be enough for you to convict him? The murdered victim is a young lady who was living on a residential street who was murdered in her living room. I happen to have one piece of evidence. Here it is. I've got a witness who's sitting across the street, observed the entire murder through the big plate glass window of the victim's house. And she told us that I saw the entire murder occur. That young woman has lived across the street from me for 10 years. As a matter of fact, the boy who killed her, I've known for 15 years. He used to be a neighbor of ours. As a matter of fact, he was wearing the shirt I gave him 2 years ago for Christmas when he committed the murder. They've been in a tumultuous relationship for years now. He's lived in that house on and off. He had been arguing with her all week. I could hear it across the street. Just yesterday, I heard him say he was going to kill her. And then I saw this murder through the plate glass window. And sure enough, the boy I've known for 15 years wearing the shirt that I gave him ran out of the house. Now, if all I had was that one eyewitness, would that be compelling evidence in this case? I think it would. I think most of you in that room would say, wow, it's not only that she just recognizes a guy, she knows the guy personally who did the murder. She watched him do it. She's known him for years. He's even wearing clothes that she gave him. That one piece of compelling evidence would be enough for most jurors. That's a piece of what we call direct evidence. It's the only form, true form of direct evidence. She can testify directly to what occurred. Now, people seem to think that you got to have direct evidence to make this case. And people seem to think that everything is direct evidence. They seem to think that DNA is direct evidence or fingerprints are direct evidence. They're not. If I found his DNA on her body, would that be compelling? And he's going to tell me, I've been her boyfriend for 2 years. I slept with her this morning. Okay, well, then his DNA suddenly has no power because the circumstance changes the power of the evidence. DNA ends up being circumstantial evidence because it would require a certain circumstance for it to be possible. If he said, I don't know this woman, I've never seen her, never talked to her, yet I found his DNA on her, now that DNA would be powerful because the circumstance makes it powerful. So even DNA is circumstantial. But in this case, she's saying with certainty, and if she can be determined to be a true, reliable eyewitness, you're stuck with this piece of direct evidence. And that's a pretty compelling piece. Obviously, if I had 3 witnesses who could all say the same thing, that's a really compelling case with 3 pieces of direct evidence. But guess what, folks? We don't get that luck in our cases. As a matter of fact, I've never had a case like this. Instead, I make a case a different way. And I want you now to stay on my jury, and I want you to make the case with me. You tell me, and I need to be able to see, Brian, because I'm going to ask you all to raise your hands when you're convinced. I can see you guys. I'm watching my video. I want you to be able to raise your hand. That's right. I want you to be able to raise your hand when you're convinced that this is the killer. But I'm going to change the scenario. I no longer have an eyewitness who saw him do it. In fact, he's now wearing a mask. So there he is wearing his mask. The eyewitness who watched it cannot identify him. She tells me, it looks a lot like the same physical build of her boyfriend who lived here for 15 years, but I can't tell you if it was him because he's wearing a mask. And, the shirt looked an awful lot like a shirt that I gave him, but I can't tell you for sure, obviously, because I can't see his face if it was him. Suddenly, I don't think many of us would convict this guy on that eyewitness testimony. It's not specific enough. So we make a case a different way. I go out and talk to this boyfriend. As a matter of fact, I do a search warrant at his house. And I start talking about his alibi for yesterday, the day of the murder. Where were you yesterday between 2 and 4? He gives me an alibi. But when I check out the alibi, guess what? I determine that he's lying to me. He's lying to me about where he was yesterday between 2 and 4. So he's giving me a bad alibi and he fits the general description. Would that be enough for most of you to convict him? How many of you in that room right now, raise your hand right now if you're ready to convict him on general description match and a BO alibi? I don't think many of you would want to convict him yet, right? So let's go a little bit further. I do a search warrant at his house. I think you can see my pop-up there, can't you? The people who are on Skype are going to pop up on the bottom there, so just ignore those, please. But anyway, back to our case here. We know when we do the search warrant, we discover a bat at his house. You know, don't forget, the woman was killed with a bat. She was bludgeoned with a bat. So, I mean, this is pretty powerful, right? We found a bat, but everyone's got a baseball bat here in America. Everyone's got a baseball bat in their house. No big deal. But it turns out this baseball bat's different. When we examine it, we can see that it's all nicked up and beat up in the meaty part of the bat. He hasn't been hitting baseballs with this bat. He's been hitting something else with this bat. And so I do a little forensic study of the bat, and I discover not blood, but I discover the bat has been bleached. It's been bathed in bleach. Now, how many of you will take a baseball bat and wash it with bleach? Not many people do that. Why would he do that? He's got a bad alibi, and he fits the general description. 3 pieces of evidence. How many of you now are convinced that he's the killer? No hands? Oh, my God. Okay, that's okay. Let me ask you a question. How many of you would say he's definitely a person of interest since he fits the general description? Okay, raise your hand. Okay, good. At least we're on the same page. He's somebody we should be looking at. Excellent. I can see just off screen that one hand was raised. That's very powerful. Thank you very much. I always feel like we're doing altar calls. You know, raise your hand if you love Jesus. Anyway, so here we go. Let's add another piece of evidence to this. He has jeans, Levi jeans. He's got a pair of Levi jeans. Now, you know, our killer was wearing Levi jeans, but everyone's got jeans here too, so who cares about that? Well, as it turns out, his Levi's are filthy, dirty, muddy, messy, except for 2 locations where when we do a luminol test looking for either body fluids or something like that, we discover, because, you know, body fluids will luminesce with this test, but so do cleaning detergents. And we discover 2 places on the jeans that are luminescing. They have been spot cleaned with some kind of detergent. But think about it. He didn't care to wash the pants. The pants are still dirty. But 2 areas on the pants he suddenly seems to be concerned about. And he spot cleans those 2 areas. What's he trying to remove? So we have spot clean pants, a bleached bat, a BO alibi, and he fits the general description. Before I take a call of hands here, let me give you one more piece of evidence. It turns out that at the crime scene, there's no sign of forced entry. Whoever got into this place got in because she let him in, or he or she, the killer, had a key to get in. Now, as you do a little research, only 2 people in this victim's life have got a key to get into her house. One's her mother, and one is the boyfriend you happen to have in custody. So he's got a way to get in the house. He's got the spot clean pants, bleached bat, BO alibi, and fits the general description. How many of you think this is our guy and are we ready to convict him? Raise your hand. A couple. Okay, well, a lot of you. And we've done this so far with not a single piece of direct evidence. We only have 4 pieces of circumstantial evidence. Come on. You'd be a great jury, but I suspect if the press was to cover this trial afterwards, they would say this jury was so slanted against him, they convicted him with nothing but 4 pieces of circumstantial evidence. But you can see what happens here is as we build the case, it becomes less and less reasonable that he's innocent because the odds are stacking against him. Who would have a bad alibi plus have the bat, plus have the spot clean, plus have the way to get in? You see how it's becoming statistically less reasonable that he's not involved. Let's go a little further. When I do the interview, he confesses to me that, yes, they've got a bad interview. They've got a bad relationship. It's been a bad relationship for years, up and down, tumultuous. Yes, he has beaten her in the past. Yes, he struck her yesterday on the day of the murder. Yes, he was overheard by friends to threaten to kill her that day, but he refuses to confess to the murder. He maintains he's not the killer, but he confesses to everything leading up to a killing, but not the killing itself. Then we do a little more research. The eyewitness tells you that the person she saw running out of the house had a pair of boots on that was very unusual, had a piece of leather on the side, a certain stripe of leather. You do a little research and find that only 1 store in 3 counties near the home of the victim even sells these boots. They've only sold 30 pairs in the last 2 years. And who happens to have one of the 30 pairs in his bedroom during the search warrant? Our suspect. So he's got a 1 in 30 pair of boots, and all the other conditions are also being met. Let me go a little further. When you do the search warrant, you discover that if you'd have arrived at the search warrant just a half an hour later, your suspect probably would have been dead because he was writing a suicide note at the time you served the warrant. And in the suicide note, he talks about having done something yesterday for which he cannot forgive himself, something terrible, but he doesn't describe it as a murder. He just says he did something terrible yesterday that he feels so bad about, he must take his own life. Now, that's a pretty compelling case, I think, for this guy right now. Would you agree that is there anybody left? Let's just do it this way. Is there anybody left in your room there in Belfast who does not think he's the killer? Raise your hand. Is there somebody back there I can't see, Brian? I think we're all in. Okay. Nobody. Okay. But now I just give you one last piece. There are times still when I have people in the room who will say, I'm close, but I'm not quite there. Okay. The witness saw the killer hop in a car and drive away afterwards. And she recognized the kind of car it was because she used to own one of these. It was a 1974 ochre-colored Carmen Ghia. And when you do a little research in your state or province, wherever you are, you discover there's only 2 operational Carmen Ghias in the entire state. And the one he happens to have in his garage is yellow. I think this kind of case is pretty powerful. Yet you'll notice that there's no direct evidence in the case. And there's no forensic evidence in the case. There's really nothing. Now you can say, well, it's forensic that you determined as a cleaning detergent on the jeans. Okay. But there's no forensic evidence tying our guy, like her blood on his jeans. That would be a great piece of forensic evidence. Even that would be circumstantial because he could argue, well, she cut her finger 2 days ago and I happened to help her put a Band-Aid on it, and that's why her blood's on my jeans. So you have to make a case circumstantially. But the point I'm making here is we just convicted a man because although his innocence may be possible, this set of circumstances makes it unreasonable that he's not the killer. So is it possible he's innocent? Of course, but it's just not reasonable anymore. And that's the power of a circumstantial case. Lots of evidence that all points to the same conclusion. And by the way, defense attorneys in this case will try to take each piece of evidence and explain it some other way. But they've got to find 8 alternate explanations for this evidence, and you happen to hold the one explanation that unites all the evidence. He's either incredibly unlucky in 8 different ways or incredibly guilty, which accounts for all 8 pieces of evidence. See the difference? These things surround him. They make it clear that he's the guy we're looking for. This is how we make circumstantial cases. This is what circumstantial evidence looks like. And here in our state, judges inform juries every day that they are not to consider circumstantial evidence as any less valid than direct evidence. You see, I think people like Dawkins don't see the difference. They see that, hey, there's direct evidence and there's nothing else. And since you don't have any of that, you don't have any case. But we make cases every day on nothing but circumstantial evidence. And judges tell juries that they are not to use the expression, it's just circumstantial evidence. There is no just. It's circumstantial evidence, it's direct evidence, it's all the same. As a matter of fact, I would argue that there are many times that direct evidence, let's put it this way, witnesses can lie to you, and often do. But circumstantial evidence can't lie to you. It is what it is. You can misinterpret it, but it cannot intentionally try to deceive you. And there are many times when witnesses will do just that. And that brings us to our examination of the Christian claims. What we have are a series of claims from eyewitnesses. And we get to test eyewitnesses in court. If they're lying to you, don't trust them. And we have a series of questions in the state of California that we use with juries to help them to investigate. And in the book, I list the entire set of questions. Here, I've just summarized the questions into 4 broad areas. Were the witnesses even there to begin with? Are the witnesses confirmed or supported externally? Have these guys been honest in the past, or are they habitual liars? And do they have some motive that might cause them to come into court today and mess with us, not tell us the truth? So in essence, I can give you 4 key words that describe these 4 categories that we examine witnesses in court every day. First, were they present? Can they be verified? Have they been honest in the past? And are they biased? These are the categories we've got to examine when looking at eyewitnesses. And we're going to do that tonight with the gospel eyewitnesses. We're going to take a look at the writings of the disciples and see if they can pass this litmus test. And the first part of the test is, were they present? And you might say, well, gosh, why would an eyewitness claim to be someplace they weren't? This is a 1974 case involving my dad. There he is in his beautiful polyester detective suit. I think he owned 2 different colors of this suit. And he hates this picture because he feels like he looks like a greasy 1970s detective, which is what he was. So duh. Okay, anyway, that's who he is. And he's walking the suspect across to the courtroom. And this is a suspect in a 1972 murder, 2 years later now, murder of a young girl. She was murdered on Thanksgiving Day here in the United States. And her body was dropped about maybe 45 miles north of our city on the coast. So she was assaulted and murdered, and her body was found afterwards. And this young man confessed to all of it. And it wasn't until we got him to court 2 years later that we discovered he wasn't even there. He didn't have anything to do with this murder. He did not know this girl. He was nowhere near this location at the time of the murder. But he enjoyed the fame that this brought to him and the relationship that he developed with the two detectives who are holding him there, the young lady and the guy behind with the sideburn. These guys became, like friends of his. And he enjoyed the hour-long interviews they would do. Hours and hours they would interview him. My dad was never convinced this was our guy, and he was rather angry because this never got solved because it was 2 years after the fact when we finally let go of the suspect, and now the case is 2 years cold. But it's not unusual to have witnesses and even suspects tell you they're present at a crime when they weren't even there because they're getting something out of it for themselves. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to ask that first question. Were the gospel writers even present? We have the life and ministry of Jesus there, the ministry running from about 30 to 33 AD. Let's just use those numbers just for the sake of argument today. And we have a church council that occurs in 363 AD. This is the first council where any group of Christians decided to affirm the eyewitness accounts. Said basically, these 27 books are the legitimate books written by the eyewitnesses or those who knew them like Luke, who are accurately telling us what occurred. But remember, by the way, that's the Council of Laodicea. The Council of Nicaea did not address the issue of canon, but it's addressed for the first time in the Council of Laodicea. The question, of course, is, when did the gospel writers write their account? If they wrote the account closer to the time of the council, there is no reason to accept it as an eyewitness account because it's written too late. It's not written early enough for the gospel writers to have been present. And that's the question under consideration. As you know, lots of writers like Bart Ehrman are making the case that you cannot trust the dating or legitimacy of the Gospels because they're either written too late, written by people who are not the people whose name is on the book. Lots of reasons to mistrust, but most of it comes down to, were they written early enough to qualify in that first level of examination as an eyewitness account? That's the question we've got to ask ourselves. And I think we can make a good circumstantial case for the early dating. Look, if these gospel writers wrote this account closer to this end of the timeline, then they can at least pass the first test. And we got to decide, is that when they wrote it? Let's make a case for this. I think most of you know that there is not a single location anywhere in the scriptures in which the temple destruction is described. We know it occurs around 70 AD. Josephus dates it for us. We know that the Roman Empire comes in, surrounds and puts a siege on Jerusalem, and eventually sacks the walls and destroys the temple. But we know the destruction of the temple would be a great thing to mention, especially since in Matthew 23, Jesus is going to predict its destruction. So why not mention it? Why not put it in there? Why? Because it probably hasn't happened yet. And I think the case is going to be made that the scripture is written before the temple destruction. We're going to make that case today. And this is the first piece of circumstantial evidence. By itself, like any piece I showed you surrounding our suspect, this is not powerful. Circumstantial evidence becomes powerful when it becomes cumulative. So we have to make cases cumulatively. There's more than one reason to believe the early dating. This is one piece. The fact it doesn't mention the temple destruction, when it seems like it would serve the purpose of the gospel writers to mention it. How about this? The siege itself is not mentioned either. That siege occurs 2 or 3 years prior to the temple destruction. I'm putting it conservatively at 69. I think it occurs earlier, but we'll put it there for now. And we know that during that siege, the people in Jerusalem suffered. What a great opportunity for Peter to mention the siege in 1 Peter, where he spends so much time describing the suffering of Christians. It would have been a powerful place to insert it, but there's no place anywhere in Scripture that describes the siege. There's no place anywhere in Scripture that describes the death of Paul. The book of Acts ends with Paul still being alive and in custody. That's interesting, isn't it? Think about it. There are important deaths that are mentioned in the book of Acts. Stephen is mentioned. How about James, the brother of John? His martyrdom is mentioned. Why not mention Paul? Peter's not mentioned anywhere either. And these deaths occur early in the 60s. So why aren't their deaths mentioned? Again, because they haven't occurred yet. As a matter of fact, James is martyred in 61 AD. I would mention him. The three biggest characters in the book of Acts, James, Peter, and Paul, all die early in the 60s, and they're not mentioned in the book of Acts? Why not? Because it hasn't happened yet. And I think this is confirmed by internal evidence as well. Look, I would put the writing of Acts right around 60, conservatively. because then at least you can explain why these pieces of evidence are missing from any scripture. They're not in there because they all occurred after Luke wrote his book of Acts. And we also know that Luke wrote something before Acts, according to both the first chapter of Luke and the first chapter of Acts. He wrote the Gospel of Luke prior to the book of Acts. So when do we date that? I'm giving it a date of 53 AD, and I'll tell you why. I think there's good reason to believe he wrote this early, because look at how Paul, well, first of all, look at what Luke says in the book of Acts, the first chapter. He's going to tell you he wrote something prior to the book of Acts. So there's good reason to date the Gospel of Luke sometime prior to the book of Acts. In the former book, he wrote about all that Jesus began to do and teach. That's the Gospel of Luke. So let's take a look at how Paul refers to Luke. We know that Paul, when writing to Timothy, and by the way, Bart Ehrman does not consider 1 Timothy to be a reliable Pauline document. So we'll just put that on the table. This is not considered, 1 Timothy is not, he does not consider 1 Timothy to have been written by Paul. But look at what Paul writes in 1 Timothy, which dates around 63 to 64 AD. He describes what Scripture says. The elders who direct the affairs of the church are well worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching, for the Scripture says. And he has two quotes. Do not muzzle the ox while he's treading out the grain. That's from the Old Testament, Deuteronomy. And the worker deserves his wages. And that statement, of course, is from the Gospel of Luke. So here's Paul quoting Luke in 63. It's clear that Luke's Gospel is available and that Timothy even recognizes this as Scripture, so that Paul can make a statement like, hey, here's Scripture, quoting something from the Old Testament, something from the New Testament, and it's already acceptable, and it's as early as 63. But let's face it, Bart Ehrman doesn't even accept 1 Timothy, so let's go a little bit earlier. Let's go 53, 57, because Bart Ehrman does accept 1 Corinthians as a Pauline document, as a legitimate Pauline document. And in this document, you're going to see that in the 11th chapter, that Paul is going to describe the Lord's Supper. And he describes it in a very distinct way that I recognized immediately, just forensically. Of all the four Gospels, only one Gospel writer mentions the expression, drink it in remembrance of me. And this is the same way that Paul describes it. Drink it in remembrance of me. And what Paul is doing, of course, is he is talking about it, quoting really from Luke 22. So either they're both familiar with the same tradition, which is early, or he's quoting from, doesn't make any difference either way. We know the truth about what happened is early, and it's captured early. And so here it is, at 53 to 57, you've got what appears to me to be a direct quote from Luke. So I think the dating Luke in the 50s is legitimate. That's an early date, and also explains all the other pieces of evidence, the two quotes from Paul, and all the missing elements that we talked about prior. But if this is the case, and I'll just tell you another little side story. When I got saved, one of the ways I came to faith was by examining forensically the Gospel of Mark. And I examined it because I knew from early church documents that Papias described Mark's Gospel. He said that Papias said that Mark took the teaching of Peter in Rome and documented it without taking any care to make sure that these pieces were in the proper order. He just took Peter's teaching about Jesus and put it in a gospel. And that's a very early non-canonical document from Papias, statement from Papias about how we got Mark's gospel. Now look what you see here in Luke's first chapter of the Gospel of Luke. He says, many have undertaken to drop an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who were first eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So clearly he's saying, I'm not an eyewitness. I'm just documenting the work of other eyewitnesses. Therefore, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, it seemed good also to me to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. Look, if you're going to tell me the history of Jesus and you're going to write it, why would you need to say it's an orderly account? Wouldn't you assume, you'll start with his birth and end with his death and resurrection? But he makes a point of saying, I'm going to give you an orderly account, Theophilus. And I think the reason why he's saying this is because the early tradition of the church confirmed that Mark had an account, but it was not in any particular order. Luke's account is going to take the eyewitnesses and put them all together, seam them all together in the proper order. And if that's the case, I would look back and say, well, who's the witness he seems to quote more than anybody else? He's quoting more than anybody else, Mark. So I think it's legitimate to put Mark's gospel first and to put it ahead of the Gospel of Luke. It seems to be the one thing that Luke is referring to in his opening chapter, and it's the thing he quotes the most. And if that's the case, look how close that date is to the ministry of Jesus. Even if you were conservative and say, I'll put it at 52 AD, it's still really close. It's within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. So the question about whether or not these witnesses were present, I think resolves itself when you look at the early dating of Scripture. The most reasonable inference from the evidence is that the Scriptures are written early on the basis of what's missing and how early it's quoted by Paul and what Luke says himself about his writing. Now let's go to the second step in this. First, we talked about whether it's present. Now we got to talk about whether or not it can be verified. And what I mean by verified is that any particular case I have, I try to verify what witnesses say, either through DNA or through. So, for example, if I've got a witness who says that the robber jumped up on the counter and leaned over and took his one hand and pulled out a gun and put it in the face of the clerk and said this or that, I probably am going to be able to find either a shoe print or his handprint on that counter. And if I do, it'll confirm for me what the eyewitness is telling me. And then suddenly the eyewitness's statement becomes verified. But how am I going to do that with an ancient text? There are a couple of ways. I wish I had DNA to confirm it with, but I think we do have the kind of biblical DNA of archaeology. We have something that confirms. Are there some pieces of the testimony that can be confirmed? Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time tonight on archaeology. I'm sure you probably looked at other, that could be a talk in and of itself. But I will tell you this. There have been many times in the past when people have doubted that people like Quirinius or Pontius Pilate or even the truthful history of Roman crucifixions could ever have really occurred, because the only accounts available 150 years ago were the accounts in Scripture. There was no archaeological verification for any of these elements. But of course, in the last 150 years, we do have now archaeological verification. For example, for Pontius Pilate, we have both the inscription has been mentioned by ancient authors, and we have even coins. So we have ways to confirm that Pontius Pilate actually exists that we didn't have 150 years ago. I can go on and I could probably just do slide after slide of these elements that were thought to be untrue, that were later verified as true. So typically, I know that archaeology is only going to do so much, but my advice to anybody who's skeptical, who says, I don't think that's true because I can't find it in archaeology, would be just be quiet and wait, because more than likely, if you make a claim now, you'll be made foolish by the later discovery of something in archaeology. By the way, if you were giving this lecture to Mormons, could you make the statement that archaeology has supported even one claim of the Book of Mormon in the North American continent? There's not a single piece of archaeological evidence to support a single claim in the Book of Mormon. And it's because there isn't. And so for example, I wouldn't expect archaeology to confirm 100% of the Bible, but I wouldn't expect archaeology to be 100% silent either. So while I think there's not 100% confirmation in archaeology, the fact that there is this much is impressive to me, given that a clear demonstration of what a lie looks like is the archaeology that's missing for the Book of Mormon. So I think that there's a good reason to accept this as verification. But there's another way to look at verification. Sometimes I simply try to find another eyewitness who can tell me if the first eyewitness is telling the truth. And sometimes this occurs inadvertently. Sometimes somebody says something that they don't mean to say. It's an unintentional confirmation. Now, what I mean by that is this. Let's say I had a bank robber, and I have him in custody, and I'm talking to him, and I said, hey, dude, I know you were in the bank doing a robbery. And he says, no way, I wasn't anywhere near that bank. So, dude, I got a videotape that shows you in the bank. Now, I don't really have that videotape, but I just throw it out there as a ploy. He says, okay, well, yeah, I was in the bank, but I wasn't doing a bank robbery. Okay, well, what were you doing in there? I was making a deposit. Well, dude, I know you wrote a demand note. He goes, no, I wasn't writing a demand. I got a video showing you writing a note. Oh, well, I was just filling out a deposit slip. Okay. Well, then you went over to the teller and you robbed her. No, I didn't. Well, what'd you do over there? I went over there and I was going to make a deposit, but I forgot my ID, so I went out of the bank. Now, has he admitted to doing a robbery? No, of course not. He denies being a robber, but he's giving me certain inadvertent admissions that are helpful for me doing the case. He's in the bank at the time of a robbery, writing down something and presenting it to a teller at the time of the robbery. That's pretty powerful, even though it's inadvertent. It's not like it's unintentional. He's not trying to confess, but he's helped me make my case by giving me something without intentionally giving it to me, without trying to help the case. So something similar happens, I think, in the first century. And by the way, I always limit my examination here of pagan sources to the first century. Do I care what some pagan source said in 250 AD? No. He's not there early enough to have contact with the eyewitnesses who could tell him it's wrong. But the sources I'm about to give you all were early enough to have contact with these people. So, for example, Thallus, who's quoted by Julius Africanus around 52 AD, is his writing. He says, when trying to describe what happened at the crucifixion, Thallus is going to say that it's an eclipse of the sun. He's going to say that it's not divine, it's not an act of God, that whatever darkness occurred at the crucifixion, it was simply an eclipse of the sun. And so in order to say that, he's not admitting to being a bank robber, but he's giving you several key things that are important. He has to admit at least that Jesus lived, he was crucified, and there was some kind of earthquake and darkness. He would just try to explain it a different way. By the way, folks, when you're in a trial and you're the prosecution and you have 10 pieces of evidence that point to the guilt of somebody, and the defense team comes up and does not try to present any new evidence, but simply tries to reinterpret your evidence, you got a good sign that you're on the right track, because it's not as though they can present evidence that, no, he was over here in Italy at the time of the murder. They can't present any evidence. They simply want you to look at your evidence and reinterpret it. I think that's powerful for us. Here's what this guy, Thallus, is doing. He's saying, hey, these things occurred, but I'm going to try to explain it in a different way. And that's what he's doing in this statement. Now, some skeptics would look at this and say, well, you can't trust this. We don't have Thallus's original document. All we have is the quote from Julius Africanus, a Christian. How can you trust that he's quoting Thallus accurately? Well, look, it's clear to me that he doesn't agree with Thallus. He says, it appears to me without reason that Thallus is calling it an eclipse of the sun. If that's the case, if you're going to lie about Thallus, just have him agree with you wholeheartedly. The fact that he doesn't agree with them, to me, is a good confirmation that he's quoting somebody he doesn't agree with, who happens to say this at a time when his readers recognize that this is the case. I think we got good reason to trust Thallus's statement here. Let's go to another one from Cornelius Tacitus. Most people recognize this description of what happened in Rome. Here he says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus, in a most mischievous superstition. Now, what could that be, folks? The mischievous superstition. Anyway, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular, kind of like Southern California. So the point here is that we've got a claim that Jesus apparently lived. He was called the Christ. He lived in Judea. He's crucified under Pontius Pilate, and his followers were persecuted. And this is definitely by somebody who's not a Christian, not a believer in any of this, but he's reporting the claims of the first century. Now, that's pretty interesting, because he also mentions a mischievous superstition. Now, I think you could actually include the resurrection in this list of claims. I have not included it here because he doesn't say it outright. But what is the mischievous superstition that's been quelled for the moment? It's probably that the Christ has been resurrected. So anyway, this is from Tacitus. Now let's go to one more. Two more, actually. Mara Bar Sarpan is a philosopher who was teaching his son about what happened to three famous leaders of philosophical and religious movements. And he writes, what benefit did the Athenians obtain by putting Socrates to death? Famine and plague came upon them as a judgment for their crime, or the people of Samos for burning Pythagoras. In one moment, their country was covered with sand, or the Jews by murdering their wise king. After that, their kingdom was abolished. I think he's referring to the temple destruction in 70 AD. God rightly avenged these men. The wise king lived on in the teachings he enacted. So here we can add a couple more features of Jesus to our list. Clearly not written by somebody who is a Christian, who accepts Jesus as anything more important than Socrates or Samos, or Pythagoras rather, but we can add that he was at least called the wise king, and the Jews somehow had a hand in his death. Let's go ahead and go to one more, Phlegon, who is mentioned by Origen. Now, again, because I believe Origen does not always talk about Phlegon in a flattering way, we can trust that he's dealing with the statements of Phlegon rather than trying to twist those statements into being pro-Christian statements. He writes that in the 13th or 14th book that Phlegon wrote that Jesus had a knowledge of future events and also testified that the result corresponded to his predictions. Maybe he's talking about Matthew 23 in the temple. Also, he says that Jesus, while alive, was of no assistance to himself, but that he rose after death and exhibited the marks of his punishment and showed how his hands had been pierced by nails. Look, folks, if you didn't have a single Christian document, you didn't have a single non-canonical early church father document. You don't have any of that. If you lost everything that you could call Christian and all you have was the writing of pagans, what would you know about Jesus? You'd know everything on that notebook. That's not bad. Would you know enough? You're stuck with this guy who apparently rose after his death and showed his injuries to his followers, who was called the wise king. Do you see how much detail you have, which is given to you unintentionally by non-Christian sources? I'm not even going to go into the Jewish sources, which are another whole set of evidences. We'll just leave it here for now. I think that as much as you could possibly confirm and verify an ancient eyewitness account, we're able to do that. Thankfully, because of how powerful Christianity was in the Roman Empire, we're able to retain enough document evidence to support as best as you possibly could the ancient eyewitness account and call it verified. But what about accurate? I mean, I'm going to give you an example here of the Michael Jackson case, only because in our Michael Jackson case here, he was brought to trial accused of molesting a young boy, and the chief witness in that case was the boy's mother. Now, the problem was, of course, was that they found out, and the defense brought this out, that the mother of the victim spent some time trying to defraud a JCPenney department store here several years before this case occurred. And they all argued that, hey, she was defrauding and lying to JCPenney to gain money in a civil suit, and she's certainly going to get money in a civil suit from Michael Jackson should she win this trial. And the jury was told that if you can determine that this witness has been a liar in the past about something very similar, then you can disqualify her in this case as well. And that's what they did. They disqualified her, and they did not consider her testimony to be reliable. We have to ask a question when looking at the Gospels. Are they reliable? I mean, these don't even line up. They don't even agree with each other. There are lots of places in the Gospels where they don't even agree. They can't even get right the statement on the sign above Jesus' cross. You've got 4 descriptions of that statement and 4 different descriptions. How many angels are at the tomb? How many women are at the tomb? I mean, there's all kinds of variations and descriptions that don't seem to agree. And you know, a lot is made of this by skeptics, right? They always point these out. This is a problem, they say. But I'm here to tell you, as a detective, this has never disturbed me. This has never been an issue of concern for me, because I recognize that over and over and over again in criminal cases, this is always the case. Let me give you an example of a case I did several years ago where a murder occurred in the middle of the night. I'm about 50 minutes from our city, so I have to get my suit on and get dressed and get out there, and it was raining that night. So the patrol officers wanted to do a favor for the witness, so they don't want them to get soaking wet, while they're waiting for me. So they put all 3 witnesses in the back of a patrol car, and they sat there together for almost an hour. So when I got there, what do you think my problem was? My problem was that all 3 witnesses now had been talking to each other for an hour and had one uniform statement to give me repeatedly, where they'd already worked out whatever issues they thought they had seen or not seen. And it ruined the case. And it ruined it because you don't allow witnesses to talk to each other before you talk to them, because you want all the peculiarities, you want all the distinctive features that are going to seem like contradictions, but will make sense once you determine their physical perspective, once you determine their historic perspective as individuals, once you determine their emotional disposition. Look, when someone points a gun at you during a robbery, your view of that guy is different than the person standing 20 feet away who's watching it. As a matter of fact, I don't expect you to see much when the barrel of a gun is pointed in your face. And perspective is both emotional and physical. What is the perspective of the eyewitness? So just for my purposes, just know this. I never, ever, ever, ever expect witnesses to agree on every detail. And if they did, I would not be happy. So the fact that they don't agree is a good thing. And it's a good thing that and you need to remember, if they did agree on every detail, something's up. That's very important. Witnesses never agree precisely. When they do, they've probably taken some time to get their stories straight. So I think the fact that there is perspectival difference in the Gospels is incredibly powerful and important. I would expect to see that, and if I didn't, I'd be suspicious. But we still have a question to ask. How do we know that in the period of time between the life and ministry of Jesus and the Council of Laodicea, where it's all settled about what's the truth about Jesus, how do we know that something didn't happen in that interim that changed the truth? It's kind of like a murder case where you have a crime scene and then eventually you get into the courtroom. Now, I want you to notice here, I think you can see my cursor as I bring it on the screen here. I'm about to put a casing right here in the crime scene. Let's put that casing there. How do I know Now, eventually, I'm going to have the same kind of evidence appear in the courtroom over here. There it is. But how do I know that this casing that I've now got in my courtroom was really there at the crime scene? How do I know somebody didn't appear in this case 10 years later and drop that casing into the property room where it looks like an original piece of evidence, and then later some unsuspecting criminalist investigated it and then gave it to some other unsuspecting detective who brought it into court. And now I've got a bad piece of evidence in the courtroom that wasn't even at the crime scene. Let's look at the life of Jesus. How do I know that what was written down here in the first century? I've already determined the early dating, right? So we know that it's written early enough to have actually been by eyewitnesses. But later on, something is going to be presented to the council. How do I know that somebody didn't appear in the late second century and change all the details and turn the itinerant preacher, teacher Jesus into the miracle working Son of God who rose from the dead? And then gave that information to some other unsuspecting follower who trotted it into the council, not knowing that it's all a lie because it was changed after any eyewitness was available to make the distinction. Well, in the crime I'm talking about on the top line, there's a way I confirm the crime scene. I simply ask, is there a detective or a police officer who early on came up and took a picture of that casing at the crime scene, then collected the casing, then booked it into property, signed his name to it, handed it over to a property officer who signed it in and signed it back out to a detective who signed it over to the criminalist who worked it for a period of time and signed it back over to another detective who eventually walks it into court. This is called the chain of custody. And in every case, I have to make sure that every piece of evidence has a chain I can trace. Then I know that that casing that started off at the scene is the same casing that's in the courtroom. So the question I have for all of you is there a New Testament chain of custody? It turns out that there is a New Testament chain of custody. And how we look at it is we simply go back and we look at the ministry of Jesus, and here's the crime scene basically, and there's the courtroom. And now the question is there anybody at the crime scene who took a picture of what was taught by Jesus? Yeah, it was John, for example. But where did that go? Who's the person he handed it off to? Remember, in our chain of custody, we need a chain, another link in the chain. Well, we look at it and we say, okay, did John have any students? Yeah, he did. He had 3, Ignatius, Papias, and Polycarp. And these people all eventually became leaders and wrote their own letters. Right around 110 AD, they were writing letters to churches because they were also leaders in their own right. So, for example, in Ignatius, we've got 7 letters written to 7 different groups in which he is quoting from John's teaching, quoting from Matthew's gospel, quoting from Luke's gospel, quoting from several of Paul's letters. In the book, I actually write out every place where he's quoting. So you can see where is it that Ignatius talks about what it is that John taught him. Papias, unfortunately, lost the writings of Papias, so I can't really tell you what he wrote. But I do have the writing of Polycarp. 1 letter survives to the Philippian church. And in this, he's going to quote the work of John, Luke, Matthew. He's going to quote Acts, Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 1 Peter, and 1 John. Not bad. We can get a snapshot of what was being taught as early as 110 by simply pulling the quotes out of the letters of these 3 students of John. These 3 students, or 2 of them, Ignatius and Polycarp, had a student of their own. And we can go to his writing, Irenaeus, to see what he was taught by Ignatius and Polycarp. And as early as 185, what we discover is that Irenaeus is starting to collect what he considers to be the reliable eyewitness account. He's got a canon. So don't think for a second that the canon was decided at 363 in Laodicea. It was simply recognized in 363. It's established as early as the grand student of John, Irenaeus. Irenaeus has already collected it. And when he teaches his student, Hippolytus virtually confirms everything that Irenaeus says. Now, unfortunately, Hippolytus ran into a little bit of trouble with the Roman leadership in the church and was exiled to the mines in Italy, where he died without a student that I can find. So this chain of custody stops short of the council. But it's clear that in the earliest days, the Jesus we know today is the same Jesus they described then. And if you needed additional chains of custody, in the book, I give you a chain of custody from Paul and a chain of custody from Peter. So you can see, well, who are his students? Who are their students? Who's the next student? Who's passing along the truth about Jesus as offered by the eyewitnesses? And how close do we bring it into the council? I think in the And if let's say, it's great that we have the work of Peter through Mark, John, and Paul. But if we lost that work and all we had was the work of their students, if all we knew about Jesus was not what's from the canonical Bible, but was instead from the non-canonical work of the students of the canonical Bible, what would we know about Jesus? Well, we know that Jesus is a guy that Bart Ehrman hates because he's a miracle worker who claims to be God, who rose from the dead. Now, how many loaves of fish did he feed to the 5,000? Are the details all there? No. But the part that Bart hates, the fact that we've got a God who came to us in the form of Jesus and died for us and rose from the dead, that's the Jesus described by these students over and over and over again. So when we look at this, I think we can have confidence. But how do we know that it's even been transmitted properly? I'm not going to go through a lot of the traditional kind of apologetics work that's done. I will mention this to you, though. It's amazing to me that a text that has this many copies of fragment evidence, as you know, there's talk now that the Gospel of Mark fragment might be publicized as early as January, right? This idea there's a first century fragment of the Gospel of Mark. Wouldn't that be fantastic? But anyway, the point is there are just thousands of fragments that are available to us. But if you study here in the States, I suspect if you were to study the Bible in college, you'd be studying it as a piece of literary fiction that you can't trust. But I don't suspect they're asking anyone to study the Iliad, but they say you really can't trust that this is what the Iliad originally said. I think for the most part, this book is considered to be trustworthy, even though it has got much less manuscript evidence. Are we finding fragments of the Iliad every day? So the old numbers used to be around 600 because nobody would ever change that number. Right now we're about 1,900 plus fragments of the Iliad. But that's a lot less than the fragments of the Holy Bible. One of the things that you see that Ehrman does is he makes statements like there are more transmission variations in the New Testament than there are words in the New Testament. That's how unreliable the document is. It's had that many changes. This word's been changed. That word's been changed. And that's true. There are small variations of just a ton of them. But if you look at the actual lines that are in question, the large blocks of information, very little is in question, about 0.5%. So I think it's not fair to say. And also, what renders the number of variations meaningless is the number of copies of fragments. The fact that we have 24,000 plus fragments renders the number of variations meaningless. And I'll give you an example of why that's the case. I have a son who's getting ready to be a med student here in the United States, and so he's always short on cash. Let's say I was to text him tomorrow using my iPhone, and I text him today, meet me next Wednesday at the Starbucks here on Main Street, and I'll give you $5,000. But having big fat fingers, I try to text him, and it comes out like this. I don't know if you can see it clearly there, given our transmission, but if you can see it clearly, there's some typos in this text. Can you see that? Can you guys see that? Okay, cool. So he's not quite sure what I mean. So I'll go ahead. You know how iPhones will auto-correct and was fill in, the words. So I tried again, and I got some of it right, but now I'm calling Wednesday weakness instead of Wednesday, so I've still got a typo in my text. But I think just with these first two texts to him, my son David probably knows what I'm trying to say. I've got $5,000 he needs, and I'm going to meet him at the Starbucks on Main Street next Wednesday. But being a perfectionist, I do it again. And now I've got another typo, a new kind of typo. I'm now calling him a nerd. So he's now saying, I don't understand. So you're funny. So the point is, I'm continuing to text to him 5 times, and every time I make some mistake. But I think David already knows. Where do you think he's going to be next Wednesday at 4 p.m.? He's going to be at the Main Street Starbucks because he wants that $5,000. With just 5 copies, all of which contain errors, he knows what my intention is. Now, what if I was really emphatic about this? Instead of doing it 5 times, I decided just to do it a ton of times. And every single time I texted him, I have an error. Do you think he'd have a hard time figuring out my meaning? No, he would get it because he can compare all of these texts and see that I've got Wednesday spelled right 50 times. I only had it spelled wrong once. So he knows I mean Wednesday. So this is why the number of copies destroys an argument about the number of variations. Here, there are as many errors as there are copies. Because we have so many copies, the errors are meaningless. This is the same dilemma we have with the text of the New Testament. So just looking at the major texts that are out there, if you're taking notes, just try to write these down real quick. These are the important ones. Okay, it's impossible. There are so many copies of variations in manuscripts and fragments that the variations are rendered meaningless. All right, we talked about 3 areas. Now we're going to go to the last one. We talked about, is it present, verified, and accurate? Finally, is it biased? Is there some underlying bias of the author that would render this invalid? When you're working husband and wife cases, you get called out to a scene and the husband smacked the wife and the wife smacked the husband. The husband wants the wife to go to jail. The wife wants the husband to go to jail. Who do you believe? Each person's got a bias. They're trying to get the other guy or the other girl in jail. That's a problem I've got to deal with all the time in husband-wife kinds of situations like this. Who's really telling me the truth? And what it really comes down to is this issue of motive. And how I usually describe it is simple. There are only 3 motives behind any crime you're ever going to work. And they're always the same. When I'm looking at a person dead on the floor, I'm asking myself, where is this victim's risk in relationship to these 3 motives? Because that's where I'm going to find my killer. So what are those 3 motives? Usually I'll ask you guys that question, but for now, I'll instead just offer them to you. There's only 3 motives, and they are, you ready? Here they are. Financial greed, sexual lust, and the pursuit of power. These 3 things motivate every other act of jealousy, anger, vengeance, are all motivated by one of these 3 motives. Now, this is the only thing that could really cause anyone to murder, to lie. So the question I have for you is, looking at the assembly of eyewitnesses, the disciples, where is their motive in these 3 areas? By the way, did Joseph Smith in founding Mormonism have any of these motives? Well, yeah, I mean, the church was written in the scripture that they would support the prophet. He had 32 wives after Emma that he wrote into scripture were ordained by God. He, at one point, had the largest standing army on the North American continent outside of the United States Army. And he ran for president of the United States. In all 3 areas, he had motive. Does having a motive make you a killer or make you guilty? No. Everyone in your room there's got a motive to do something stupid, but we just don't do it because we're restrained by other factors. Having a motive does not make you bad, does not make you guilty of anything. But every person I've ever worked who was guilty of something had a motive. So it works in one direction, but not in the other. So the question I have is, looking at the life of the disciples, do we really think that they had any motive in these areas? Especially considering what they were willing to do rather than simply recant and admit that it's a lie. When they were captured, tortured, and called on to recant, did they ever recant? Do we have one ancient testimony of anyone in which it says that the apostle Matthew, let's say, died a peaceful life on the French Riviera sipping, margaritas? No, we don't have that kind of an account because every account we have, every tradition we have is the same. These guys had no power, no financial success, died alone, and they couldn't even stop their own martyrdom. So what's the motive really that people think they had that would bias them? I'm at a loss to figure out what it could be. Now, I want to answer one last question before we stop tonight and take questions from you guys. I often hear this statement made, you can't trust the Gospels because they're written by Christians. Really? That's just such a stupid statement. I just have to give you an illustration of why it's so stupid. Here's a robbery I worked one time in which this man came in to do a bank robbery, and he's doing it right now in front of you. Here he is. I'll isolate him for you. He came in, waited in line. He walked up, presented a gun, told her what he wanted. She is now in the process of handing over the money. The gun is back in his waistband. Okay. When he first walked in and got in line, the lady sitting at the desk behind them recognized him because she went to school with him. Ooh. And she was about to get up and actually introduce herself and say, hey, do you remember me? But he got through the line so fast and she was busy with the customer that she didn't get a chance to do anything until he got to the front counter. And once he was here, she looked over at her coworker and saw the look she sees whenever a bank robbery is occurring. She realizes now, probably in this photo, that her coworker is being robbed by a guy she went to high school with. Wow. Now let's say, I can tell you right now, she was shocked. And I know she was shocked because I have a slide here that confirms it. There she is. She's shocked. Now, I can tell you that she's sitting there and she's shocked and surprised because she knows this guy from school. Now, if I was to go in and investigate this robbery, I probably shouldn't even talk to her. Because think about it for a second. She's already convinced that he's a bank robber. You might say that she's a Robert Smithian because she's convinced that Robert Smith is a bank robber. Isn't she biased now? I mean, there's no point in my talking to her. She's not neutral anymore. She's a Robert Smithian. I need to find somebody who's neutral to tell me what really happened here. Now, that's pretty stupid, isn't it? I mean, that is a ridiculous way to approach this. She was not convinced that Robert Smith was a bank robber when he first walked in. As a matter of fact, she was shocked to find out that he was. She didn't start off as a Robert Smithian. She ended up as a Robert Smithian once she saw him commit a bank robbery. So the same thing is happening here. I think we can trust her as an eyewitness the same way we can trust John or Matthew or any of the disciples who wrote Gospels, because they didn't start off as Christians. They ended up as Christians once they saw Jesus do what Jesus did. I suspect that most of us will probably be in the same place. It's not that they started off with Matthew doesn't start off as a Christian. He's a tax collector. He ends up as a Christian watching everything that Jesus said, taught, and did in the resurrection. So these are not disqualified as eyewitnesses because they didn't start off with any kind of bias. Now let's go back to our suspect for a second. We made a strong circumstantial case related to our suspect's guilt based on the strength of these pieces of circumstantial evidence. In a similar way now, let's take a look at the case for Jesus. We're making the same kind of case, building a circumstantial case based on the early dating of the scriptures, which solve a lot of problems that most skeptics will throw out there, by the way. The fact that they are quoted and verified by archaeology, and that they're described by non-Christians, we talked about that a little bit. The fact that they're transmitted accurately and can be trusted, and the fact that they're attested by people who are willing to give their life rather than recant. So we have a case we're building on Jesus, which is circumstantial. In the book, I show how each of these pieces themselves are also built circumstantially. So in the end, we have hundreds of pieces of evidence pointing to the same conclusion. So this is the kind of case we're doing. We're surrounding him again, the same way we surrounded our suspect. This is how we build circumstantial cases every day. This is how we're going to build a circumstantial case about the nature of Jesus. And just as the opposite of our suspect we looked at and we asked the question, hey, can I trust what this guy says? Can I trust anything about him? Is he telling me the truth? Can I count on him? Should I put my hope in him or my confidence in him? Or should I go to him for answers? Well, we know no, you can't trust that guy. In a similar way, we've examined Jesus. We know we can trust him. This is why the kind of a sterile examination of the facts related to the history of Jesus doesn't end there. It now gives me confidence that I can trust what Jesus said with my very life because I've already confirmed his veracity through the evidence. I can count on what he says, not just about his life and his ministry, but also what he said about eternal life. I can trust because I've verified him with the evidence. So that's basically my presentation. As you know, the book publishes next month. So now all you can do is kind of order it online. But this is you can see the line illustration. I want to put this illustration up for you. You can see that all the illustrations in the presentation I've turned into line drawings for the book. So all the illustrations are in the book, the chains of custody, all of that. I've just turned them into line drawings to help make the case. All right, so I'm glad that's the presentation, folks. Now, any questions you have, I'd be happy to entertain.
Hi, Jim. Great presentation. You mentioned
Thank
a
you,
bit about Paul quoting from Luke as scripture. My question would be,
Yes.
why doesn't Paul quote more from scripture, or even anywhere other than Luke, like Mark or Matthew, if they were around before Paul wrote his letters? Thanks.
Yes, no problem. I think that's a great question. I think that part of the problem we have, two objections are typically raised to Paul's use of Luke. One is this one, which is, why wouldn't you quote it more? Well, I think looking back at it in hindsight, if we were in this generation and we thought that, we think that we're looking at Paul's writing and saying the purpose of Paul's writing for us tonight is to confirm the presence of Luke's gospel. But Paul never has that as his goal. He doesn't see that, hey, thousands of years from now, some detective is going to be looking at this, and I better include a lot of quotes. He assumes that his congregation is familiar with all the scriptures. And he's always making a case, Paul, of how prophecy makes the case for Jesus. So I think you find him spending a lot more time in those texts that contain the prophecies, which are the Old Testament texts. I think he sees he doesn't understand how valuable it would be to us if today he just would have even made the statement, by the way, folks, I'm holding the Gospel of Luke here and I'm holding the Gospel of Matthew. And, wouldn't it be great if he would just tell us what we want to know? But I don't think he's going to do that for us. Instead, we are able to forensically find it. But the fact that he's even able to quote it and to call it scripture, I think this is one of the reasons why Bart would deny 1 Timothy. And this is what I see often by the skeptics, is they're not denying. I asked Dan Wallace about this recently. They're not denying the early dating of Scripture because they have some manuscript evidence that causes them to deny it. Instead, they're saying they will deny those aspects because they contain prophecies. Matthew 23 clearly predicts the destruction of the temple. Therefore, since the destruction occurred in 70, Matthew 23 could not have been written prior to 70. And this is what they're using to date Matthew after 70. We've got to get rid of 1 Timothy. How could you be calling a quote from Luke? You see, you just get rid of those texts that would involve anything that is against your case. And that's what I see happening over and over again, is that's the powerful way they're doing it. So I think the reason why you don't see that first objection about Paul is that I don't think Paul saw it as his mission to confirm for us thousands of years later the presence or existence of these scriptures. Here's the other objection I see. How do we know that Paul isn't just referring to an early oral tradition, and Luke is also referring to that, rather than is he really referring to Luke and Luke's writing? To me, that makes no difference. If I find an eyewitness in a case, I sometimes have two kinds of eyewitnesses. 30 years ago, one eyewitness was interviewed by detectives at the time, and his eyewitness statement was written down. Great, good to have that. Another eyewitness I find 30 years later, and that eyewitness has never been interviewed by anybody. And now she tells me something. The question then simply becomes, is her statement reliable? And I've got good evidence to compare to see if it's reliable. It doesn't matter that it wasn't written down. She's still a reliable eyewitness. If he is simply quoting oral tradition that hasn't been written down, it's still powerful eyewitness testimony. Your eyewitness testimony does not become eyewitness testimony when you write it down. It becomes eyewitness testimony. What's important to us is, were you there to see it? You might not talk about it for 30 years, but when you finally talk about it, were you really there to see it? So to me, whether you're quoting oral tradition or a written document makes no difference. They're quoting somebody who was there to see it. That's the important part. And later on, we do have written documents that confirm this version of what occurred. So I think we're okay. Remember, any single complaint, like this is, I failed to say this during the presentation, but in the end, the same way the defense attorneys want to pick off each little piece of evidence that surrounds the bad guy, skeptics want to pick off each little piece of evidence that confirms our narrative. And they've got to explain it in other ways. But again, which is more reasonable? Is it more reasonable to accept the 6 or 7 or 8 different explanations they've got to offer, or the one unifying explanation that seems to cover all of it, which is that Jesus just did what the Gospels say he did, said what the Gospels said he said? So I think that's how we look at it. We got to look at it and say, which is more reasonable? The 6 explanations required on that side, or the 1 explanation required on this side? Of course, they would say, folks, that our explanations are not reasonable simply because they contain supernatural explanations, and they're disqualified for that reason. I'm simply asking people to suspend your presupposition against the supernatural until you've investigated the evidence. Then make a decision. Don't start off rejecting the supernatural. You might end up rejecting it, but don't start off that way, because you'll definitely end up rejecting it in the end if that's where you start. Does that make sense?
Hi, Jim. Thanks for your presentation tonight. Hi. Yeah, I was the hand. You mentioned about Thaddeus mentioning evidence for an earthquake and the darkness of the sun at Jesus' resurrection. William Lane Craig, I'm sure you know him very well, was questioned on that in one of his debates, and he put it down to it could have possibly been poetical term from Matthew. I'd be really interested in what would your viewpoint of that be? What is your comment on it?
Are you talking about the darkness at the crucifixion, or are you talking about something else other than the dark?
There's darkness, the earthquake, but he specifically, I think he's pushed on the resurrection of the saints. And I know there's no obviously evidence there that you mentioned from Thales. Sorry, I'm not good at the Greek names. But surely, if those first 2 things happened, it's sort of the possibility of it being poetical sort of reduces. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm not, and I know that this is, first of all, you won't see me, I'm very careful about using words like possible, right? For the very reasons we talked about in our presentation. There's a big distinction between possible and reasonable. I don't give a lick about what's possible. Possible never helps me. When a defense attorney starts off, Detective Wallace, isn't it possible that? I always say, well, of course it's possible, because anything is possible. It's just not reasonable. Now, they're going to want to strike the last part of my response, okay? But I'll tell them, yeah, I want the jury to get it. Stop listening to language that includes the word possible. It might as well be blah, 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 blah. It's meaningless. It doesn't matter what's possible. We're not even going to allow you to consider it. What's all that matters is what's reasonable. So looking at this account of the saints rising out of their tombs at the point that I think Michael Icona most recently kind of got himself in a situation writing his book, right? The response he got from Norm Geisler and others related to his comments. Could this be rhetorical? Could it be poetic in some way? Could it be, is it literal? I don't think that it's even necessary for me to make that distinction. Let me tell you why. I don't think it's a runaway. I'm not running away from the issue. Do I believe in biblical inerrancy? Absolutely. But do I believe inerrancy is required to come to a saving faith in Christ? No. What's important is, are the accounts reliable? Not are they inerrant. I make cases every day with eyewitness accounts that are not inerrant, but they're reliable. There's a difference. If I was waiting for an eyewitness who was inerrant, I'd be basically out of luck, because there are no such things. So what I'm looking for is eyewitness reliability, which is going to contain some I'm always going to have questions. I tell my jury this all the time. You're not going to get every question answered in this trial. If you think you are, we can't have you sit on our trial, because there are going to be lots of unanswered questions. Sometimes it's an unanswered question that's raised by the suspect, the defendant in the case. Sometimes it's an unanswered question raised by an eyewitness. You can't figure out, how could that be true? But if you're waiting for an answer to every question, you're going to be excused. May thank you for your service. But we can't have you here, because we're looking at reliability, not inerrancy. That's an important distinction to make. So I don't think if it was me, you asked me, it doesn't matter. And that's controversial, because people will say, you're saying you don't believe it happened? I'm saying it doesn't matter to me if it happened, because I'm looking at reliability as the key feature of the Gospels, and they passed the test. They passed the test. Now I'm stuck with a reliable eyewitness. What do I do with it? That's the decision I have to make, right? And I'll tell you something. I don't have a moment of conversion. I had a process of conversion as I struggled to find a way to reject the reliable eyewitness account. But in the end, you're stuck with it. And that's where I think we're stuck with here. Now, by the way, personally, do I believe that the saints were raised out of tombs? Yeah, I do. I do, because I think the eyewitnesses are reliable. How do I explain that? Don't know. There's lots of eyewitness things I get from eyewitnesses I can't explain. But I don't say, oh, the case is over, I give up, I'm not going to try this case. I just know there are some things you're never going to be able to explain from an eyewitness. Get over it. That's life. So, I mean, this is how I look at it, okay? So from my perspective, yes, it's inerrant. Yes, I believe it. At the same time, I'm not overly concerned about the fact I can't answer every question. So I think there are some principles, see, from courtroom experience that you can actually take and articulate to your friends, because this is realistic. I mean, if we were waiting for that beyond a possible doubt kind of response, would we ever convict anybody? No, we would never know anything with enough certainty to move forward. I would be afraid to go out of my house if I had to have that level of satisfaction, right, on any truth claim. Oh my gosh. So get real. I mean, if we use this standard beyond a reasonable doubt to decide the temporal fate of human beings in this world, I have death penalty cases, okay? We decide the fate of humans given the standard beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a more than good enough standard for you to decide your eternal fate. If we decide your life and death with that standard, you can determine your eternal life and death with that standard. Not to beyond a possible doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt. And we're already there with the evidence for Jesus. The truth is that most people already get it. They just want to reject it for some other reason. And that's where I think the real battle for us is that I wish every person we met resisted the truth claims of Jesus on the basis of rational objection. But you know that's not the case. You know that's also emotional, volitional. Those two areas are probably larger than the rational dissenters. It's the emotional and volitional rejectors. That's where my dad is. He knows the evidence. He's worked with evidence his entire life. I've made this case to him. Doesn't get it. I'm not having any success because his objections are not rational. They're volitional. That's harder for me to change. God changes that. I can only offer the evidence. The volitional, emotional stuff, God's got to work in that area. And I don't pray enough about it. I act like I can do it. I need to be on my knees about my dad. We need to be on our knees about our lost friends. Because in the end, the vast majority are holding to these objections that only God can remove. So it's tough. But I mean, we just don't stop doing this work, right? We just have to be praying more.
All right, thanks for the answer to the last question. You talked a bit about dating sort of Mark around 35 AD, 40 AD, and then John at 70 AD. What do you make of the argument that put forward that as the Gospels get later, they progress more in their sort of Christology and the views of Jesus, so that you see in John, which is the last Gospel, it's John 1, very highly, very much God is an equal with Jesus, whereas Mark less so. What did you hear in response to that sort of objection?
Yeah, I think if you were to go back and look for examples in the Gospel of Mark in which Jesus is divine by some statement of Mark, you would find that they're there. You would find there are lots of statements by Mark related to the divinity of Jesus. But let's back up for a second. There's another parallel. Typically if you're talking to a cop or a detective, you're going to get all detective responses. So let me just offer a parallel in terms of the kinds of cases I do. I've had cases where I've had a couple of eyewitnesses, sometimes more, like 10, in a big shooting or something. And all these eyewitnesses are presented to me, and I want to do the investigation. So I get my notepad out, and I'm writing with each person. I'm standing on a corner of the mall or wherever this occurred, and I'm talking patiently to each witness. Thanks, God, your information. Next one comes up. I try to keep them separated. Officers are keeping them separated while I'm getting ready to interview them. And I one time remember I had a guy standing off to the side, and he was standing next to an officer. So I figured, well, he must be cleared by the officer. Didn't think anything of him. I didn't make an effort to stay out of earshot of this guy. I figured he was a friend of the officer. So I'm standing there, and I'm taking all the eyewitness statements, and this guy standing here next to us with the officer, they're hearing all the statements of the eyewitnesses. But I didn't think anything was a big deal because obviously the officer would not let somebody stand next to him. He shouldn't let stand next to him, which wasn't the case. But anyway, I get all done. And up walks the officer with the guy. He says, "Oh, I wanted to tell you, this is another witness." I'm like, "What? Why didn't you tell me earlier? I don't want the witnesses to hear what the other witnesses say." So, of course, now he gives me his eyewitness statement. And do you know what he did? He would not repeat anything he heard the other people. He gave me a very brief eyewitness statement that just kind of like filled in the blanks that he didn't hear the other people say. And I had to say, well, stop. I want you to go back. I don't care what the other people have said. I want you to start at the beginning and tell me everything that happened from the time of the crime started to now. Don't just give me the fill-in stuff. Why? Because late witnesses, if they're aware of what the first witnesses say, will try not to repeat. They usually won't repeat that stuff. They'll just give you the stuff that they didn't mention, or if they think there's a better view of it, they'll give you the better view. So the fact that John is a late entry, it doesn't surprise me that he's not necessarily going to cover all the same things that the early witnesses cover. He's going to fill in the blanks. If he thinks you didn't get it, he's going to make sure you get it. Well, that happens all the time in eyewitnesses that I interview too. So I have no reason to reject John, just to understand his position in the line of eyewitnesses and what he thought it was his important to do. If somebody would have stopped John and said, "No, John, I want you to go back and kind of cover it all for me. Pretend like I don't have a Gospel of Mark or a Gospel of Matthew or a Gospel of Luke. I want you to go back and pretend like you're the only Gospel where we're going to have." Who knows what that would have looked like? But he came in as a late witness thinking he was going to do one kind of job. Well, that's what every late witness thinks. You have to force them to go back to the beginning and rewind and do it all over again, or they won't do it for you. So that's, I think, to me, I look at that and I say this is further evidence that this is a late eyewitness account, not late in terms of seeing, but I mean, it's the last one written, and he's got a specific purpose. What's the point in covering the same stuff over again? I'm not Luke trying to put together an account for Theophilus. I'm the Apostle John who saw a bunch of stuff, and I want to make sure you get what I saw. Okay. That seems legitimate to me.
Thanks very much, Jim. I just want to ask one quick question. I was reading on Josephus. Have you heard of Josephus's texts? He's one that often people mention that it had been tampered with by Christians. I wondered if you had a parallel as well in evidence, and where evidence is tampered with, and some people call for it to be completely thrown out, and some people claim they can identify what has been tampered with and what hasn't.
Absolutely. This is separating artifacts from evidence is what I call it. In every crime scene you go, there's going to be a great deal of evidence and a bunch of unrelated artifacts. Here's what I mean. You get to a crime scene, I get there after the paramedics. The shots are fired, patrol cars go. They get there, they're on scene. Well, they dispatch fire department or paramedics. You have that similar kind of thing there, I'm sure, where you've got a paramedic team that's going to go to the scene along with your law enforcement. And when they first get there, the urgency is to try to save the life of the victim. So paramedics get to enter the scene, and they're not careful about evidence. As a matter of fact, they mess up your scene pretty bad. half the blood smears of your scene are not part of the struggle of the crime. They're the paramedics trying to save the life of the victim. So every crime scene is filled with evidence and artifacts that aren't related. It's my job as a detective to figure out which is which. And I don't stop simply because there are artifacts in my scene. I don't say, well, I can never know what happened here because there are some bunch of artifacts. No, I figure out how to remove the artifacts so I can limit what is evidence. And that's what we do anytime we see something. So, for example, the addition of that passage of scripture where the woman is brought to Jesus, the adulteress is brought to Jesus and thrown at his feet, and he writes in the dust, and he tells those who accused her, who has basically you're living in a glass house here, but go ahead and throw the first stone, and everyone kind of retreats. Well, that passage is not found in the earliest manuscripts of the Bible. As a matter of fact, when it does come in, it comes in very late, and when it first appears, it's not even in the same gospel. It's placed in now. It's clear that that's an artifact. That I don't consider that to be evidence. True evidence from the gospel writer. I consider that to be a late artifact in the crime scene. But because I know how to take it out textually, I know how to subtract it, I know from looking at my crime scene what I can remove that's just from the paramedics, I remove that out. I do the same thing with that late entry and remove it out. Now, as far as Josephus goes, I did use Josephus in the book. I think he is a non-biblical eyewitness account, but I have to be very careful about which version I use. I try to go, and what I had a version I liked that Paul Meyer usually writes about, right? And Paul Meyer has this version that he's used, which he thinks is the strictest, most limited version of the Josephus account that we can trust. It still helps us a great deal. So I included that, and I sent the book. When I first wrote it, I had several people vet it before it got to final edit. And the people I had read it were Craig Hazen from Biola here, J.P. Moreland, Paul Copan, Greg Kokel, Sean McDowell. So I had 5 people vet it. And I made all the changes they suggested because I want to make sure I wasn't writing any checks I couldn't cash. So anyway, the point was, when I got to the issue about Josephus, Greg Kokel at Stand to Reason wrote to me and said, hey, and he was very late. It was like July of this year. It was pretty late in the process. He said, I don't think you should use that Paul Meyer version. I got a better one. And I'm like, how am I got to talk to my publisher if I can even get this in now, right? But I did. And so I now am using a 10th century Arabic form that we think probably has less reason to be tampered with. And that's the form of Josephus's quote. But let me tell you, it still is very helpful because while some aspects of the later, again, we're doing that same work. We're entering the crime scene saying, can we remove artifacts and get back down to just the basic evidence in the scene? I think we can do that even with Josephus. So yeah, I did use a version of Josephus, but I tried to use the version in which I removed all the Christian artifacts. However it's been corrupted by the paramedic, I try to take that out and get back to what's at the crime scene. But we're always doing that, right? That's how we're doing it. And I think people recognize that process from the kinds of things you watch on TV. And we're doing the same thing with the scriptures. I'm looking through the scriptures and trying to say, hey, the fact that there's a late edition does not bother me. It doesn't bother me to take it out. I mean, why is there no ending to Mark, the original Mark? There's some argument about that. Maybe that ending to Mark is the best version of Mark. But even if it isn't, why would it bother me, given what Papias says about Mark quoting from Peter in his sermons? It's quite possible he just quoted what Peter did. And this is why Luke comes back and gives you the most robust version with the birth narrative and the ending. Everything's in place with Luke because Luke tells you he's putting it in an orderly account because this account apparently didn't exist. It needed to be put together by the eyewitnesses. And I think that's a powerful, powerful statement. And it might explain why we see certain things in Mark we don't see other places. And we're going back and we're saying, hey, what's the artifact? What's the evidence? Just because there's an artifact does not mean we don't have good evidence. So that helps.
Okay, I got a question. And it revolves around sometimes how you will be talking with someone, and I know that they're using different terms than you would be using, or using terms in a different way than what you'd be using. They might say something where you say, well, here's a few arguments you'd present to them, and they might object with, well, that's not evidence. That doesn't prove anything. And as you've alluded to, they'll take things apart piecemeal and shoot them down bit by bit, divide and conquer. So when you're interacting with people, how do you suggest addressing this notion of proof, what counts as evidence, and how to make sure people don't just take things apart like that?
Right. Well, I think I was making simple statements because, again, most of these objections we get from our friends and family are really quick, rhetorical, soundbite objections. And they are not, if you got a response that's 15 pages long, forget it. Once you're past the soundbite limitation of their attention span, you've lost them. And so I simply will say, well, gosh, I've never made a single case with direct evidence. Never have. If direct evidence was required to make cases, I have nobody in jail. And that's, to me, this is the truth of it. That's how long it take to say that. I want them to understand that circumstantial evidence is powerful. And what makes circumstantial evidence powerful is when you've got a lot of it pointing to the same conclusion. If I had a bunch of pieces of evidence and pointed to 15 different conclusions, then any of those might be equally reasonable because I only have one piece supporting each premise. But if in fact I've got 10 good reasons to believe this is true, and you're going to have to find 10 alternate explanations to say it's not, you don't have a case. I have a case you're just trying to pick apart. Now, if on the other hand, you can say there's another suspect who also answers all the questions raised by the same 10 pieces, I got a problem. Because now your guy's as good as my guy. And maybe I'm wrong. That isn't the case with our position. They have to use a diverse set of explanations. By the way, the same thing is true when looking at the evidence for God's existence. We're going to take it from very different disciplines. The axiological argument is a highly philosophical argument based on the existence of morals. Compare that to the teleological argument based on an evidential argument based on the appearance of design. Or the cosmological argument, the ontological argument. We've got lots of different arguments that can be resolved if, in fact, there's a God that designed everything. Or they've got to be explained away in one of 10 other ways. It's not that there's one explanation which will satisfy all the questions raised by all the other arguments for God's existence. Our one explanation will satisfy it, but they've got to go to more than one explanation to satisfy it on their side. That's a good indicator that we have the truth. When our one explanation will satisfy all the evidence and they require 10, you have the truth on this side. Now, if he can take that same evidence and go, yeah, but you know, my guy Joe Smith, who lived next door to the victim, it turns out those same pieces of evidence you've offered point to him equally. Now I've got a problem because he's got one explanation that satisfies the evidence. So keep that in mind. It's a very simple principle. I look for that all the time when I'm with the defense. Is the defense going to call a witness? Do you know how many times I do a case where the defense doesn't even call a witness? Instead, they want to pick apart the witnesses that I've called. Really? Do you mean to tell me that your case, you don't have a single witness to support some alternative reality that you want the jury to believe? Instead, all you can do is pick apart mine. And of course, they do it under the pretense that, hey, the burden of proof is on you. That really isn't the case, though, when we're working with our friends, right? Because our friends believe that naturalism explains everything. They have to make an affirmative case for naturalism, as we're making an affirmative case for our Christian theism. But if we're wrong, how do you explain the appearance of design from a natural perspective? How do you explain the appearance of consciousness, of free will, of moral virtue, of moral vice from a naturalistic perspective? I think that burden is still on them to make that case. And if you see that they don't have any evidence for that, and we have all kinds of evidence we're trying to pick apart, that's a good indicator they're the defense attorneys in this case, just trying to defend a guilty client. That's what they do all the time, is they look at our case and they say, hey, I have nothing new to add, but I can certainly try to pick apart your case. Okay, go for it. We win those cases. I don't think we've ever been in a jury deliberation longer than 6 hours on cases for which we have no physical, forensic, direct evidence. Never more than 6 hours. So these are compelling cases. You can make those kinds of cases, dear friend. But you're right, though, Brian. You've got to first, I think, deal with the issue of what's the nature of evidence. And I would simply say, well, detectives very rarely have direct evidence. And it's true. We very rarely have direct evidence. The only true form of direct evidence is an eyewitness who watched the murder occur. That's very rare in a criminal case. So I think you could powerfully say and accurately say that if all we could use in court was direct evidence, we'd convict very few people. So.
Okay, cool. Thanks. Okay. Another question is along this line. Maybe we're listening to this, and we're like, "Wow, that's really great. I'm convinced by it. That bolsters my faith. And now I see things and I understand them in a better way." But boy, I can't take that and talk to my friends because I can't remember all the your whole presentation. Like, can you give us some tips that, in general, for interacting with others and just being a case maker and how that works, even if we feel like, boy, I haven't done all this work you've done, I don't understand it like you do, but I still want to do something without feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah. Well, this is the dilemma. This is one of the reasons why I hate it, because you know me well enough, Brian, to know that I have been an atheist for so long. And one of the reasons why I was an atheist for so long is I felt like Christians on TV, here at least in America, were so consumed by their desire to make money that I didn't trust them, that they really cared about the truth. I thought they were in it for the money. As a kid growing up, I remember watching a televangelist every morning. He had a 5:30 a.m. show here locally for half an hour. 5:30 is pretty early, but I would get up at 5:30 to watch him because I was entranced by the way at 21 minutes into the message, he would move from message to money. He would find a way to take that message and turn it into a request for money. And he would do it so seamlessly. I thought it was the most skillful rhetorical thing I've ever seen. And I just simply wanted to see how he did it. I was amazed. No way can he do this now. He's talking about Noah. How is he going to go from Noah into money? He did. He found a way, no matter what he was preaching on, to go into a request for money. So as an atheist coming to faith, I wanted to make sure that whatever we did is like your model. We're going to give it away for free. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to charge anything. We're not going to, I've pastored for years for no money. We're not going to take tithes and offerings and spend it on the church. We blew out my garage and we do church here with 50 people for years. We did that because we didn't want overhead. We didn't want a bill. We wanted to collect the tithes and offerings and give them to places where we thought there was real true need that wasn't us. We weren't the ones we were giving to. That was powerful for me. And it's not to say it's a virtue. I think it's a failing because I think that the workman does deserve his wages. But it was something that for years I resisted writing a book because I felt like I'm just going to become another one of these people selling a book. So here's how it works for us. The stuff that we cover in the book has been stuff I've been teaching online for years for free. And I'm willing to send that stuff in PDF files to people. I think all of us in this room need to understand that there is so much that we want to defend and we're ill-equipped to do it. If I was here and I was Hugh Ross or Buzz Rana talking about molecular biology, or I was some other expert, you would have the same problem. It makes sense. I get it, but how in the world am I going to recommunicate that? I can't recommunicate that stuff. I can't. I can't recommunicate William Lane Craig stuff. That guy's the smartest guy I know. How are we going to listen to a debate from William Lane Craig and go, oh, I can now talk about that? No, I can't. That's Bill Craig. Dude, that's like, forget it. So this is what we have in trials. We have expert witnesses that we call into trials. And we call on the expert witness because they can offer something that we can't offer. They know stuff we don't know. They're DNA experts. They're behavior analysis. They're linguistic experts. They're forensic experts of one nature or another. We call them in. We have them testify. And when the jury examines the case, they often will recall testimony. They'll say, can I get the read back on expert so-and-so? Because I'm not quite sure I understand it. And they get that recall back. But we make sure that the transcripts are available for the jury to read the testimony because I know they're going to have a question about it later. All of us, I have a huge collection, as Brian does. Most of my stuff came from Brian. But I have a collection of resources that I keep on my hard drive because I don't expect to remember all that stuff. There's no way I can remember all this stuff. I can't even remember today what I wrote in that book a year ago before I turned into the publisher. I always think, did I write that in the book? I can't remember. So I don't expect us to remember. I expect to have a resource I can recall in the jury room, get the read back. That's what we do with expert witnesses. So start your collection now. And what you do is when someone presents a problem, you say, hey, I know there's an answer for that. It's along these lines. Give them a rough brushed, view of the answer. But I'm going to send you the more in-depth work if you're interested. But honestly, are you really interested? If you are, I've got a 30-page report sitting on my hard drive. I'll email it to you because I need you to get the expert testimony of that eyewitness. And it would be unfair for me as a juror. And that's what we all are, by the way. We're all jurors. None of us here are experts. We're just jurors. And we're going to have to read this back to each other, recall expert testimony so we can make a case to somebody else. So don't be afraid to collect that data. I put all this stuff in the book because it's a one place you can go to get all of it. Now the question is, how do I get it in the hands of people without violating my own ministry practice for the last 10 years? How do I do that? I don't know yet. I'm working on it. It's hard. But I did decide to go with David C. Cook as a publisher, and here's why. David C. Cook is a nonprofit whose profits go into global ministry. When you go there, the first floor is publications, the second floor is integrity music, the third floor are all the ministries they support with their profits. So I wanted a publisher who held the same ministry model that I held. And that's what I was able to find with David C. Cook. So I feel pretty comfortable in that sense. But again, it's like anybody, I own all of these bookshelves are filled with Bill Craig and Stephen C. Meyer and all the people that you guys are reading. I keep them back here because I know that I can't remember that stuff. I got to be able to go back to it. And that's what I expect everyone to do with even this stuff, is find a way to get it on their shelf and then go back to it when you need it. That's all you can do. That's what I do. So.
Hi, you mentioned a bit about Bart Ehrman and sort of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy and his doubts about it, but I know he's sort of the mainstream, but quite a lot of scholars would question the authorship of the sort of 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy and Titus. Do you have any response or arguments in favor of their Pauline authorship?
Well, the question I always have is on what basis do we, like, it's like anything else. You come in court and the defense is going to make a claim, and they'll sometimes make it in their opening statement, but they'll definitely make it in their closing argument. The opening statement is meant to be neutral, but the closing argument is to be argumentative, and they'll make this claim. Now, we get a chance to rebut. We do a closing argument. They do their closing argument. We do a rebuttal because the burden's on us. I think when someone makes a claim like this in a closing argument, I'm simply going to ask, on what basis would you doubt the authorship of Paul? And we should be able to look at that basis. And I asked Dan Wallace this year, 2012. We were at an event in Dallas in April, I think it was. And I was with Greg Kogel. And we wanted to know, why are these things doubted? Is there manuscript evidence reasons? Now, the most you're going to usually find in terms of the doubt that I've seen so far is simply there's some stylistic change. There's something that's stylistically different about a book or a portion of a book that causes doubt. So, for example, there's the whole series, Who Wrote Genesis? Is it really Moses? Is it a series of, you've heard all the different theories on this, right? But it's clear that this was written over a long period of time. I can tell you that I had an editor tell me, after reading the book, that he liked the spirit of the last chapter of the book, and he wanted to retain that spirit in the first chapter. And what he was talking about was the fact that I had written that book over a period of just 4 months, and my attitudes kind of changed, my mood kind of changed, whatever it may be. The end of the book did not look and feel like the beginning of the book. It felt like somebody else was writing the end. Can you go back and get that spirit, and push it over here? So I saw that even in a 4-month period of time, the same author appears to be 2 different authors to somebody who actually even knew it was the same author. And he's asking me to go back and kind of make it look and feel more like it's the same author. Don't tell me that a book that's written over a period of time, which clearly Genesis must be, is going to have to be consistently the use of words. I use certain words in the last chapter that I never used in the first 4. That cannot be the criteria upon which I can reject the authorship of Jim Wallace on that book. That alone cannot be the criteria. I would say, is it possible? Absolutely. Anything's possible, but it's not reasonable. And that's what's so ridiculous. So when someone makes that claim, they want us to camp on what's possible. Fine. That's why I think we make a good case for the difference between possible and reasonable. Reasonable requires a significant amount of evidence to make a proper inference. And without that significant amount of evidence, all you have is a possible doubt. You don't have a reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubts are grounded in evidence. So I ask juries, look at what's causing your doubt. Put it on the wall. Write on the wall the doubts of all the jurors. And then ask yourselves, are those doubts caused by evidence or caused by something else? If they're caused by something else, they're not reasonable doubts. They're possible doubts, and you can comfortably come to a conclusion and ignore those. So I think when people make this kind of objection, we got to say, hey, be honest, is that really a reasonable doubt or a possible doubt? I asked Dan, was there any reason textually to reject authorship that we have right now in the canonicity of the New Testament? He says, no, it's not based on manuscript evidence. It's based primarily on the presupposition of naturalism. If you got an account that includes miracles, that cannot have been written early because clearly the eyewitnesses would have rejected it. So therefore, we have to go late. If you've got an account that includes prophecy, like Daniel's prophecy, clearly that cannot have been written at the time of Daniel. It had to be written much later because there's accurate prophecy in there. And most of these things are driven by a presupposition of naturalism, he said, rather than by textual evidence. And if Dan can say that, I'm pretty confident. I think Dan Wallace is the Bart Ehrman of the Christian world. Bart Ehrman is the Bart Ehrman of the atheist world. So I think we've got two different authorities here, but with equal standing, in my opinion. I think Dan's work is marvelous, and what he's doing right now in reclaiming ancient documents and documenting them is phenomenal. So I trust Dan. There's no relationship to me, except of course we all are descendants of William Wallace. That's the only common thing. We all say that, right? If we're a Wallace, you can be a Samoan with a Wallace as your last name, and we're still going to say we're descended from William. So, anyway.
All right. Well, I think that we have exhausted our time and then some, but we really want to thank you, Jim, for all your hard work, for providing this lecture and just taking the time. We really do appreciate it.
I'm glad to do it. As you know, those of you who are sitting in that room probably realize it, but you are in the midst of a guy who's doing incredibly important kingdom work. Here in the States, we talk about it all the time. I was just on the phone with Lee Strobel talking about the work that Brian does and how important it is. He's a unique anomaly in the apologetics world. Bringing together, I told him today, he's the funnel point through which everybody else must pass so that all of us get all the information we need. So I don't underestimate your work, Brian. I really appreciate you, and I always have. And everyone I can tell you here on this side of the States really knows that you're doing good, important work. So thanks for having me. I'm always available to you guys whenever you want to talk, okay?
All right. Well, we're signing off. Thanks from Belfast here.
Good to meet all of you. What a great group. Thanks so much.